I want to speak to the misnomer that biosimilars are the same as generic drugs. The that is something that I commonly hear from employers. I do want to emphasize that biosimilars are not generics because the generics are typically um, produced by using chemical synthesis, as mentioned earlier, versus the biological and the biosimilars go through that complex biological process and synthesis in living tissue and living microorganisms. I also want to mention a few terminology that I think it's very important to understand. There is something called substitution, which is the practice wherein the pharmacist may dispense an alternative medication for another without approval of the prescriber. And that is typically applied for generic, but it's not always applied to between biologicals and biosimilars. There's also automatic substitution where it just happens automatically in the system as soon as it's prescribed. The other terminology that I want to mention is the switching. Switching is actually the practice wherein the prescriber decides to exchange one drug with another. And that could happen between biological biosimilars, but as you can see, it's different than talking about biosimilars um, and generic medications. And then we go into the interchangeability as as a term that's defined by statute to mean that the product may be substituted for the reference product without the intervention of the prescribing health provider. And this comes from the FDA, and it requires a lot of studies and a lot of rigorous process to go through. There's a similar process in Europe under the European Commission Consensus Information, and they also define interchangeability as the medical practice of changing one medicine for another that is expected to achieve the same clinical effect in a given clinical setting and in any patient on the initiative or with agreement with the prescriber. So when we're talking about biosimilars and genetic medications, obviously there is a huge difference between the ability to have the substitution, the switching, and the interchangeability. FDA approval pathway for biological biosimilars are a little bit different than other medications. It does require extensive clinical studies, including phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 clinical trials. And it also requires periodic safety updates from the manufacturers and these journal literature to constantly evaluate the safetiness and effectiveness of both biologics and biosimilars.